The story of Saint Genevieve begins not in grandeur, but in quiet simplicity. Yet from the very beginning, there were signs that her life would be anything but ordinary. Born around 419 or 422 in the small village of Nanterre, near Paris, she would one day become the beloved patroness of the great city. Her feast, celebrated on January 3rd, continues to honor a life that shaped the spiritual destiny of a people. Genevieve was the daughter of Severus and Gerontia. While popular tradition often portrays them as humble peasants, it is more likely that they were respected and relatively well-off townspeople. This detail matters because it suggests that Genevieve's path was not one forced by hardship, but one freely chosen, a deliberate turning toward God from an early age. The defining moment of her childhood came in the year 429, when two great bishops, Germanus of Auxerre and Lupus of Troyes, passed through Nanterre on their mission to Britain. They had been sent to combat the spread of Pelagianism, a theological error troubling the church at the time. As they journeyed, they stopped in the village, and the people gathered eagerly to hear them preach. Among the crowd stood a young girl, quiet, attentive, and deeply absorbed in what she heard. There was something about her presence, something in her demeanor, that caught the attention of Germanus. While others listened, she seemed to receive. After delivering his sermon, Germanus did something unexpected. He asked that the girl be brought before him. Speaking to her with kindness and seriousness, he encouraged her to remain steadfast in virtue. When he learned of her desire to dedicate her life to God, he did not dismiss it as childish imagination. Instead, he recognized it as something genuine and profound. Turning to her parents, he made a remarkable prediction. Their daughter would grow into a life of holiness. Not only that, through her example and teaching, she would inspire many others to follow the same path, leading countless souls toward a life consecrated to God. In that moment, what seemed like a simple encounter became a turning point, not only in Genevieve's life, but in the spiritual history of a city and a nation. From that day forward, her path was set. The quiet girl from Nanterre would grow into a woman of unshakable faith, one whose courage, devotion, and influence would one day stand between Paris and destruction. But even before the miracles, before the fame, before the trials, her story begins here, with a child, a calling, and a destiny recognized by a saint.
Welcome to Stories of the Saints, a place where history comes alive through faith, courage, and unforgettable lives.
Here, we explore the powerful journeys of saints like Bernardine of Siena and Genevieve, men and women who faced real struggles, made bold choices, and left a lasting impact on the world. Whether you're searching for inspiration, deeper understanding, or simply meaningful stories that stay with you, you're in the right place. Subscribe and join us as we uncover the lives that shaped history and still speak to us today. The morning after that life-changing encounter, the bond between the young Genevieve and Germanus of Auxerre deepened in a way that would mark her forever. Before departing from Nanterre, the bishop sought her out once more. Standing before him again, Genevieve renewed her desire, clear, sincere, and unwavering, to dedicate her life entirely to God. She was still very young, yet there was nothing uncertain about her resolve. Recognizing the depth of her commitment, Germanus blessed her and gave her a simple but powerful token, a small medal engraved with a cross. This was no ordinary gift. It was a sign, a reminder of her consecration to Christ. And with it came a gentle but meaningful instruction. He urged her to set aside worldly adornments, to leave behind pearls and golden ornaments, and instead to wear this humble symbol. In that moment, a quiet but profound transformation took place. Genevieve chose simplicity over status, devotion over display. At a time when there were no convents nearby to shelter or guide those seeking a religious life, Genevieve remained in her family home. Like many early Christian women called to holiness, she lived her vocation in the ordinary rhythm of daily life. Yet there was nothing ordinary about the way she lived it. Her days became marked by prayer, innocence, discipline, and a growing interior strength that would later define her public witness. The exact moment when she formally received the religious veil remains uncertain. Some traditions suggest it occurred during the return of Germanus of Auxerre from Britain, while others hold that it happened when she was about 16 years old. According to this latter account, she was consecrated alongside two companions by the Bishop of Paris, marking her official entry into a life fully dedicated to God. But whether early or later, the outward ceremony only confirmed what had already taken root within her heart. Genevieve had long since made her choice. Then came another turning point. With the death of her parents, her life took on a new direction. Leaving behind the familiar surroundings of Nanterre, she moved to Paris, where she went to live with her godmother. It was a quiet transition, but one filled with meaning. The girl who had once stood unnoticed in a village crowd was now stepping into a larger world, a city where her faith would soon be tested, her courage challenged, and her destiny fulfilled. For now, however, her life remained hidden, formed in silence, strengthened in prayer, and guided by a devotion that would soon shine far beyond the walls of her home. In the quiet years of her early life in Paris, Genevieve embraced a path of devotion that was both deeply spiritual and intensely demanding. Her faith was not expressed only in prayer, but also in a life shaped by charity, discipline, and voluntary sacrifice. She dedicated herself wholeheartedly to works of mercy, serving those in need with consistency and humility. At the same time, she adopted a strict form of personal austerity that reflected her desire to live entirely for God. Her lifestyle was marked by severe mortifications, practices of self-denial that were common among early Christian ascetics but rare in their intensity and perseverance. Genevieve abstained completely from meat, choosing instead a simple and restrained way of eating. Even her fasting was rigorous. She broke her fast only twice a week, maintaining this discipline with remarkable consistency. These practices were not temporary expressions of zeal, but a long-term commitment that shaped her entire spiritual life. What makes her dedication even more striking is its endurance. For over 30 years, she continued these forms of austerity without interruption. Through seasons of hardship, doubt, and external pressure, she remained faithful to this demanding way of life, seeing it as a means of drawing closer to God and interceding for others. Eventually, however, her spiritual intensity reached such a level that her ecclesiastical superiors intervened. Recognizing both her holiness and the physical toll of her extreme practices, they judged it necessary to moderate her austerities. Out of obedience, Genevieve accepted their guidance and reduced the severity of her mortifications. This moment reveals an important dimension of her character. Even in her most intense devotion, she remained obedient to the Church and open to correction. Her holiness was not only expressed in sacrifice, but also in humility and submission to spiritual authority. Through these years of disciplined prayer, charity, and self-denial, Genevieve formed the spiritual strength that would later define her public mission. Her hidden life of sacrifice became the foundation for the extraordinary role she would eventually play in the history of Paris and the faith of its people. As the reputation of Genevieve grew, so too did opposition against her. In her own neighborhood, jealousy and suspicion began to spread. Many of her neighbors, unable to understand her deep spiritual life, accused her of deception and hypocrisy. What others recognized as holiness, they interpreted as illusion or fraud. Like later figures such as Joan of Arc, Genevieve was said to experience profound spiritual visions and prophetic insights. But instead of being received with reverence, these experiences were met with hostility. Her claims were dismissed, her sincerity questioned, and her reputation attacked. The situation grew so severe that her enemies even plotted against her life. At one point, there were conspiracies formed to drown her, an attempt to silence her influence entirely. Yet, just as tensions reached their peak, intervention came through the support of Germanus of Auxerre. His authority and spiritual credibility helped calm the hostility directed toward her, gradually restoring peace and protecting her from further harm. Recognizing her virtue and spiritual maturity, the bishop of the city entrusted Genevieve with an important responsibility: the care and guidance of virgins consecrated to God. In this role, she was not only a guardian but also a teacher. Through her example, discipline, and instruction, she led these young women toward a higher level of spiritual commitment and sanctity, shaping a community rooted in prayer and devotion. But even as her influence quietly grew within the church, a far greater crisis was unfolding beyond the city walls. In the year 451, fear spread across Gaul as Attila the Hun and his forces advanced through the region, leaving devastation in their path.
Panic gripped the people of Paris.
Faced with the threat of invasion, the inhabitants prepared to abandon their city and flee in terror. It was in this moment of fear and uncertainty that Genevieve's story would take a decisive turn, moving from private struggle and local opposition to a role that would define her as a spiritual protector of an entire city. In one of the most defining moments of her life, Genevieve stepped forward as fear consumed the city of Paris. As the terrifying advance of Attila the Hun and his forces threatened destruction, panic spread rapidly among the inhabitants. Many believed escape was the only option, and preparations to abandon the city were already underway. But Genevieve called the people to a very different response. Instead of fleeing, she urged them to place their hope in God. She encouraged them to remain, to pray, and to undertake works of penance. Her message was simple but powerful. If they turned their hearts back to God, the city would be spared. Her words initially met resistance, but gradually they took hold. Fear gave way to trust. Panic was replaced with prayer. Against all expectations, the people chose to remain in Paris and follow her guidance. In a remarkable turn of events, Attila's forces diverted toward Orleans instead, and Paris was left untouched. What had seemed like certain disaster became, in the eyes of many, a sign of divine protection. Years later, Paris again found itself caught in turmoil when Maravec took control of the city. During this period of conflict and siege, Genevieve once more demonstrated her deep commitment to the people. She was not only a spiritual figure but also a living example of charity and self-sacrifice, actively caring for those affected by war and hardship. Her influence extended beyond moments of crisis. Through her presence and moral authority, she helped shape the attitudes of successive Frankish rulers, including Childeric I and Clovis I. These rulers, influenced in part by her example, showed an unusual degree of mercy and restraint toward the people of Paris, a shift that contributed to greater stability and compassion in the region. Genevieve's vision was not limited to immediate survival or political outcomes. She also played a role in shaping the spiritual landscape of the city itself. It is traditionally held that she inspired the plan for a church in Paris dedicated to St. Peter and St. Paul, reflecting her desire to anchor the city's future in faith. This project was eventually begun by Clovis at Mont-les-Paris shortly before his death in 511, marking the beginning of one of the city's most significant early Christian foundations. Through moments of invasion, political change, and spiritual renewal, Genevieve remained a constant presence, guiding, protecting, and shaping the destiny of Paris through faith, courage, and unwavering trust in God. After the passing of Genevieve, her life quickly became the foundation of a lasting spiritual legacy in Paris. She died the following year, and in a powerful expression of reverence, her body was placed within the very church that had been completed in her honor. From that moment, the site became inseparably linked with her name and memory. What followed only strengthened her reputation for holiness. Numerous miracles were reported at her tomb, drawing pilgrims, devotion, and widespread veneration. The church itself gradually became known as St. Genevieve, reflecting the deep belief that her spiritual presence continued to bless the city she once protected in life. Over time, the shrine attracted the attention and generosity of rulers and citizens alike. Kings, princes, and ordinary people contributed gifts and wealth to honor her memory and preserve the sacred site. The church thus grew not only as a place of worship, but also as a symbol of national devotion and identity. However, the sanctuary did not remain untouched by history. In 847, during the turbulent era of Norman invasions, the church was plundered, suffering significant damage. Although efforts were made to restore it, The reconstruction was only completed in 1177, reflecting centuries of instability and renewal. Even then, the story of the building was not finished. As time passed, the structure again fell into decay. In response, King Louis XV initiated the construction of a new and more ambitious church in 1764, intending to restore the dignity of the sacred site. Yet history took another dramatic turn. Before the new church could be consecrated, the French Revolution broke out. In 1791, the unfinished building was seized by the Constituent Assembly and transformed into a secular monument known as the Pantheon. Its purpose changed dramatically, from a house of worship to a national mausoleum dedicated to honoring distinguished French citizens.
Through all these transformations, devotion, destruction, rebuilding, and reinvention, the memory of Genevieve remained at the heart of the story.
Her legacy endured not only in religious tradition but also in the very landscape of Paris, where faith and history continued to intertwine across the centuries. The legacy of Genevieve did not fade with time. It evolved through centuries of devotion, upheaval, and renewal in the city she once protected. Even after her death, her presence was believed to remain powerfully connected to Paris, especially through the relics preserved in her church, which became a center of deep and lasting veneration. Over the centuries, the site associated with her grew increasingly significant, both spiritually and historically. Despite periods of political change and secular transformation, the sacred memory of Genevieve persisted. The building dedicated to her underwent repeated shifts in purpose. At times restored for Catholic worship, at other times converted into a national monument. In 1831 and again in 1885, it functioned as a secular mausoleum, reflecting the changing religious and political landscape of France. Yet even in these transitions, the memory of the saint remained deeply embedded in the identity of the place. What most powerfully sustained her legacy, however, were the accounts of miraculous intervention attributed to her intercession. One of the most striking events occurred in 834, when Paris faced the threat of devastating floods. According to tradition, through her heavenly assistance, the city was spared from complete inundation, reinforcing the belief that her protection continued long after her earthly life. Another extraordinary moment came in 1129, during a catastrophic outbreak of a disease known as the mal d'ardence. This violent plague swept through Paris with terrifying speed, claiming more than 14,000 lives. In the midst of despair, the people turned to prayer and organized a procession in honor of Genevieve. In a remarkable turn of events, the epidemic abruptly ceased, an outcome widely interpreted as a response to her intercession. Through floods, plagues, political change, and centuries of transformation, the figure of Genevieve remained a symbol of hope and protection for the people of Paris. Her story became more than history. It became a living tradition of faith, resilience, and enduring spiritual presence within the life of the city she was believed to guard. In the turbulent 12th century, the devotion surrounding Genevieve reached a moment of official recognition that would further cement her place in the spiritual life of Paris. When Innocent II came to Paris in 1130 seeking the support of the French king against the rival antipope Anacletus, he was also drawn into examining the powerful reports of miracles attributed to Genevieve's intercession. One miracle in particular, the sudden cessation of the devastating plague known as the mal d'ardence, had already become the subject of widespread devotion. Determined to investigate, Innocent II personally reviewed the accounts and evidence surrounding the event. After careful examination, he became fully convinced of its authenticity. Moved by what he had witnessed and heard, the Pope officially sanctioned the memory of the miracle. He ordered that an annual feast be celebrated on November 26th, ensuring that the event would be remembered not merely as local tradition, but as a recognized act of divine intervention connected to the saint's intercession. To commemorate the miracle, a small church known as Saint Genevieve d'Ardence was constructed. For centuries, it stood as a physical reminder of the moment when the plague was believed to have been halted through prayer and faith. However, in 1747, this chapel was eventually demolished to make way for the Foundling Hospital, marking another chapter in the evolving landscape of Paris. Despite the disappearance of the church, the devotion did not fade. Each year, The relics of Genevieve were carried in solemn procession to the cathedral. These events became deeply significant public ceremonies, blending faith, tradition, and civic identity into a shared expression of gratitude and reverence. One particularly vivid account of these processions comes from the writings of Madame de Sévigné, who described the grandeur and emotional impact of the event in one of her famous letters. Her testimony captures not only the religious importance of the procession, but also its cultural resonance in the life of Paris. Through papal recognition, annual feasts, enduring processions, and literary remembrance, the legacy of Genevieve continued to shape the spiritual imagination of the city she was believed to have protected long after her earthly life had ended. The long history of devotion to Genevieve was marked not only by reverence and miracles, but also by periods of destruction, reform, and survival through turbulent centuries. During the upheaval of the French Revolution in 1793, revolutionary forces targeted many religious institutions, and the Church of St. Genevieve suffered greatly. Most of the sacred relics preserved there were destroyed, swept away in the wave of anti-religious sentiment that defined the era. Later, in 1871, the remaining relics that had survived earlier devastation were once again desecrated and cast out by a mob, further deepening the sense of loss surrounding her physical legacy in Paris. Yet, remarkably, not everything was lost. A significant relic had been preserved much earlier at Verneuil in the Oise region during the 18th century. This surviving relic endured through the chaos of revolution and remains extant, serving as a tangible link to the saint's enduring veneration despite centuries of upheaval. The church, originally built under King Clovis I, had a long and complex institutional history. At first, it was entrusted to the Benedictine order, who maintained its religious life and traditions. However, by the 9th century, the Benedictines were replaced by secular canons, marking a shift in the administration of the church. Further changes followed in 1148, during the time of Pope Eugene III and King Louis VII, when canons from the Abbey of St. Victor at Senlis were introduced to restore discipline and strengthen the spiritual life of the community. The process of reform continued into the early modern period. Around 1619, King Louis XIII appointed Cardinal François de la Rochefoucauld as Abbot of St. Genevieve. Recognizing that the canons had fallen into laxity, the cardinal took decisive action by selecting Charles IV to lead a reform of the community. This effort aimed to renew spiritual discipline and restore the integrity of the religious life associated with the saint's shrine. Through destruction and renewal, neglect and reform, the story of St. Genevieve's Church reflects a larger truth. While buildings and relics may be lost or transformed, the memory and influence of the saint herself continued to endure in the spiritual imagination of Paris and beyond. Centuries after the death of Genevieve, her spiritual legacy experienced a powerful revival through reform movements within the church in France. In 1594, a deeply devout man was born who would play a key role in restoring religious discipline and renewing communities inspired by her memory. He later entered the canons regular at Senlis, beginning a life dedicated to prayer, order, and reform. Known for his strong personal holiness and determination, he faced significant challenges upon becoming ordained. Despite resistance and difficulty, he eventually succeeded in reforming the abbey, bringing renewed spiritual structure and discipline to a community that had grown lax over time. His reforming influence did not remain isolated. Many other houses of the canons regular were inspired to adopt similar reforms, spreading a wider movement of renewal across France. In 1634, this reforming leader, together with 12 companions, took responsibility for Saint Genevieve du Mont in Paris, a site deeply connected to the legacy of the saint. This moment marked a turning point. The community they established there became the mother house of a new religious congregation known as the Canons Regular of Saint Genevieve. From this foundation, the reform movement expanded significantly, strengthening religious life and discipline in multiple regions throughout France. The influence of Genevieve's legacy also extended beyond the male religious communities. In 1636, another institute inspired by her name was founded in Paris, the Daughters of St. Genevieve. Established by Francesca de Blosset, this new congregation focused on works of mercy, particularly caring for the sick and educating young girls. Their mission combined practical service with spiritual formation, reflecting the charitable spirit associated with the saint herself. Together, these developments show how the memory of Genevieve continued to inspire renewal, service, and reform centuries after her death. Through both the Canons Regular and the Daughters of Saint Genevieve, her legacy evolved into living institutions that shaped religious life, education, and charity across France. Alongside other religious movements inspired by the legacy of Genevieve, another important institute emerged in early 17th century France under a different spiritual inspiration but eventually became part of the same devotional current. In 1611, Marie Benoît de Rubella Beauharnais de Miramion founded a community popularly known as the Miramions. Dedicated under the invocation of the Holy Trinity, this group was established to promote religious life and charitable service in a structured but flexible form. Their mission reflected a growing movement in France toward active lay-inspired religious communities focused on education, care, and devotion. Over time, this institute merged with another similar foundation, and in 1665 the two were united into a single body known as the Canonesses of Saint Genevieve. This new community retained a distinctive character. Its members did not take permanent religious vows, but instead made a commitment of obedience to the community's rules for as long as they remained within it. This allowed for both structure and flexibility, enabling women to dedicate themselves to service without the permanence of traditional monastic life. However, like many religious institutions in France, the Canonesses of Saint Genevieve were disrupted during the French Revolution. The political and social upheaval of the period led to their suppression, and their work was brought to a temporary end. In the early 19th century, the spirit of the institute was revived. In 1806, Jean-Claude Jacquelet re-established the community under a new name, the Sisters of the Holy Family. Though renewed in form, the mission remained deeply rooted in service, education, and care for the vulnerable. Today, this revived congregation continues the work of its predecessors on a large scale. The Sisters of the Holy Family are responsible for over 150 schools and orphanages, carrying forward a legacy of teaching, nurturing, and social support. Through centuries of transformation, from Miramions to Canonesses to a modern religious congregation, the enduring thread remains the same, a commitment to service inspired by the spiritual heritage of Genevieve, whose name continues to symbolize protection, care, and faith lived through action.
From a quiet young girl in Auxerre to the spiritual guardian of Paris, the story of Genevieve stretches far beyond a single lifetime.
It becomes a thread woven through centuries of faith, crisis, rebuilding, and renewal, touching kings, cities, revolutions, and ordinary people alike. Her influence survived invasions, plagues, political upheavals, and even the complete transformation of the city she once protected. Churches were destroyed and rebuilt, relics were lost and rediscovered, institutions rose and fell, but her name never disappeared from the heart of Paris. Instead, it adapted, endured, and continued to inspire new generations in new forms. What makes her story so remarkable is not only the miracles attributed to her, but the way her legacy continued to shape communities long after her death through reformers, religious orders, educators, and charitable institutions that carried her spirit into changing times. Even when buildings were repurposed or traditions interrupted, the idea of Genevieve remained alive, a symbol of courage in fear, faith in uncertainty, and service in times of need. Today, whether seen in historical accounts, churches that still bear her name, or institutions inspired by her example, her presence remains part of the spiritual and cultural fabric of Paris. She is remembered not only as a saint of the past, but as a continuing story of hope that has survived every age it has passed through. And that is where her story leaves us, not in silence, but in continuation. Because legends like this are never truly finished. They live on in memory, in devotion, and in every generation that rediscovers them anew. If you're drawn to stories that go beyond history books, stories of courage, faith, struggle, and hope, then you're in the right place. This channel brings to life the powerful journeys of the saints, not as distant legends, but as real people who faced real challenges and left a lasting mark on the world. From figures like Genevieve to Bernardine of Siena, each story reveals something deeper about resilience, purpose, and conviction. By subscribing, You're not just following a channel, you're joining a growing space dedicated to preserving these timeless stories and sharing them in a way that inspires today's world.
If these stories speak to you, stay with Stati Uniti. There's always another life, another lesson, and another moment of truth waiting to be uncovered. Thank you for watching all the way to the end.
It truly means a lot that you stayed through the entire story and explored the journey of faith, history, and legacy with us. These stories come alive because of viewers like you who take the time to listen, reflect, and engage. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next inspiring story. And feel free to share in the comments what saint story you'd like to hear next. We'd love to feature it. See you in the next story.